Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of the Love is Stronger Than Fear podcast. I'm your host, Amy Julia Becker, and each week we are going to take a look at current events, aka the coronavirus, and we're going to consider a small portion of Paul's letter to the Philippians. Paul wrote this letter under adverse circumstances, and he wrote about how to know joy, peace, hope, and love, not by denying the hardship of the moment, but by knowing God in the midst of that hardship. I hope that reading the Bible in our current moment of uncertainty and turmoil will help us to turn away from fear and toward love. Thank you for joining me. So here at my house, we are entering week 5 of the coronavirus shutdown or shelter in place or lockdown or quarantine, whatever word different people are using to describe the situation that many of us across America find ourselves in. For my kids, this is week 5 of either spring break or distance learning, which means I've got 3 kids. They are 14, 11, and 9. So they are in front of 3 different screens as I record this podcast. And my husband is actually still able to go into his office because no one else works in the same building. So that's what we're doing. One of the things we've been doing is actually having more family time over the course of these 5 weeks. And one of the shows that we have been watching together is called The Good Place. You may or may not have heard of The Good Place. It's actually finished now. I tend to come to pop culture, a few years late, which is the case with The Good Place, but I highly recommend this show. It's probably too mature for our 9-year-old, but it's great for middle school and adult viewers. So we're really enjoying it, and it's talking about what makes a person good. And if you are good or bad, are you deserving of eternal reward, eternal punishment? It's pretty funny. It's pretty witty. There's a lot of Kant thrown in there. So if you are someone who likes philosophy or theology plus humor, the stars of the show are Ted Danson and Kristen Bell, then you might enjoy it too. Anyway, we've really enjoyed it. And our son William has watched all 4 seasons of The Good Place. The family as a whole is on season 2. He's watched all 4 seasons and has really internalized some of the debates going around during the show. So maybe a month ago, we were sitting at the dinner table and William poured himself some water. Marilee then said, "William, will you pass me the water?" He passed her the water and there was, a half an inch of water left. A sip, maybe 2. So Marilee rolls her eyes at William. Marilee is my 9-year-old. William's the 11-year-old. And she says, "Really, William?" Because William knows that whoever finishes the water completely is responsible for getting up from the table and refilling the water. So when he was pouring his water, he very intentionally poured out everything but those last couple of sips so that the next person would have to get up from the table and refill the water. "Really, William?" Marilee says. And he says, with a shrug of his shoulders, "I didn't kill it." So she gets up and gets the water, and I'm kind of glaring at him in the meantime. And he goes, "Mom, so just think about it for a minute. What if I tried to be like Jesus all the time? I mean, I think Jesus would have refilled the water. And I think Jesus would have done it willingly. So do you think Jesus would he unload the dishwasher without asking anyone else to help all the time? Would he fold all the laundry?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure that he would always be unloading the dishwasher and folding the laundry, but if he were doing those things, he would be doing it because he loved the people he was doing it for. And if he weren't doing those things, it would also be out of love. Either way, his motivation would be love, not selfishness." And William, it was pretty funny because he just sat back and he was like, good thing I'm not trying to be like Jesus. It was not something that motivated him to a different way of action. It just got him thinking about what it would be like to be motivated by love, how it would lead to a different approach to passing the water bottle at our family dinner table. Honestly, for him and for many of us, to be motivated by love, by self-sacrifice, seems pretty impossible. It's a standard, an ideal that's hard to meet. And yet there's also some part of us that really longs for it, which I think is why that came into William's mind in the first place and why a show like The Good Place brings up so many good questions. We long to live in the ideal, but it's not where most of us live most of the time, and it's certainly not where we're living right now. But for many of us, it's not where we're living right now, even in our own families, our own houses. I know in my house, there's been plenty of bickering. We're fighting over things like who gets the last popsicle and whether or not it's fair that William got a new bike and Marilee got a hand-me-down. We're fighting over screen time, and we're fighting over who gets to set the table or who must set the table tonight. And that's just the surface layer of our discontent. So I want to read the short passage from Philippians that we're going to be looking at this week and talk about what is the ideal, this vision of an ideal communal life, and what gets in the way of that? What impedes that ideal? And how might we move beyond those impediments to a full and whole life of love? Philippians, I'll just remind you, is written by the Apostle Paul to an early church about 2,000 years ago, but it's really relevant in our current moment because it's written from a place of suffering and written with an exhortation to have a joy that doesn't come from surface happiness, but from a deep wellspring of love and hope. And because it is written from a person who's writing in isolation to a community and speaking about what it means to live with faith and hope in the midst of insecurity. This is the beginning of Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. What a vision. Do nothing from selfish ambition. Look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Be of the same mind, having the same love. For the Philippians, for us, for William, this often seems impossible. And what I want to talk about is why. Why does it seem impossible? Why does a life of unity and care and kumbaya, hippie glory, why is that so hard for us as human beings? I think these past couple of weeks as a nation have actually exposed human nature in both its glory and its shame. So there are these heroic and ordinary stories about the way human love has triumphed in these past few weeks. We've got nurses and doctors who are going to work knowing that they don't have the protective gear that they need. We have elderly people. I've heard multiple stories of elderly men and women who have said, you know what, give the ventilator to someone else. I can take my chances with death because I have lived a good life and I'm ready to give that to someone else. There are the more ordinary sacrifices that I've heard about, certainly of parents staying home with their children, of teachers learning how to navigate Zoom, of businesses pivoting to make masks, to give out free hand sanitizer. I've also heard about single people who are self-isolating, living entirely alone out of a care and concern for the common good. I also read a story in the Washington Post about the Samaritan's Purse. It's an organization led by Franklin Graham, who is a conservative Christian, and it's a conservative Christian organization, setting up to serve people inside the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is a kind of notoriously liberal Christian sanctuary and space. And I thought that vision of a conservative Christian organization working within the space of a liberal Christian organization spoke to this vision of unity, of making joy complete, of having the same love and being of the same mind, of unity, even if not uniformity of belief. So we do have these beautiful images of people who are sacrificing, serving one another, caring for one another in ordinary ways like moms and dads caring for their children, and in more heroic ways like the nurse in my town who just went back to work and had a stream of cars where people out the window were cheering for her. But we've also seen human selfishness and human division come even more to the surface, right? It exposes our humanity in all of its glory, but also all of its shame, to be in a time of trial. So we see the extreme examples of people trying to profit from fake drugs that they say will cure or protect against the coronavirus. We also just see, I think, inequity has been exposed in a way that's really uncomfortable and really troubling. I remember reading right when New York City was shutting down their public schools that there would be hundreds of thousands of children who went without lunch because of the schools being closed. That 750,000 children were living below the poverty line. That 100,000 of them were homeless. New York City is 2 hours away from where I live, and I was not engaged with or aware of that reality. So it exposed inequity and injustice simply to say, here's what happens when we take school away. For my kids, it's inconvenient. They need to come home. We need to rig up some old laptops. It doesn't mean that they are not getting lunch anymore. It doesn't mean that they're not getting an education anymore. There are children in other cities and rural parts of our nation where education is really hard to come by right now as a result of all sorts of different social inequities and divisions. We've seen the inequity in healthcare across the country, that people without health insurance are not aware of whether or not they can get care in this time of need. We know that even for people who can get care, the coronavirus has actually caused more death, disproportionately more death among African American and Hispanic communities than among the white population. We don't know exactly why yet, and there are all sorts of reasons, but it brings up again these disparities and inequities. We see even an inequity in the ability to protect ourselves from the coronavirus, to socially distance ourselves. Most white-collar jobs enable people to stay at home and work from home. Many blue-collar jobs in the service industry do not. There are people who have second homes or who have enough wealth to have the option of leaving cities in order to be in a more protected space. And many people who are poorer end up staying in more crowded communities and therefore risking more exposure to this virus. This whole experience exposes hierarchies of care. I've been reading about the disability population, and certainly whether or not people like my daughter Penny, who's 14 and who has Down syndrome, are at any higher risk of contracting or suffering from this disease than other kids their own age. And thankfully, in her case, I don't think she's in a higher risk population just because she has Down syndrome. But plenty of people with disabilities are in a higher risk population, and especially for those who are living in group homes, they're also in these spaces where it's really difficult to stay protected from this virus. So they're all the more vulnerable and all the more exposed. Prison populations are also in a similar situation. So this experience of the coronavirus in our country has brought forth some of the beautiful acts of love and service that people are willing to offer to one another, both on an individual and a more systemic level. It's also exposed inequity, inequity, and injustice. It shows us ourselves, right? It shows us human nature. And I would say there are three aspects of human nature that are true to my experience, that are what the biblical record tells us is true about humanity. And these are those three things: that we are created. We are creatures, not just beings, but creatures. And as a result of being created, we're vulnerable. We're needy. We can't simply take care of ourselves. We actually depend upon the Creator and upon the created order. So we are created beings. Secondly, that we're created in God's image. This goes all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, but it also runs throughout the Bible, this idea that we are in God's image, that somehow we reflect the being of God in who we are. I am not going to go into all of the implications of any of these things, but what I will say is that the Bible also tells us that God is love. And I believe that what it means to be created in God's image is to be created as those who love and who are loved, as those who give and receive love. When we are doing that, we are the most true to who we are and to God's image within us. So we are created in God's image, but we also are fallen and broken. And again, the Christian understanding of this goes back to the beginning of Genesis. And we use the word sin to describe what happened when we turned in on ourselves instead of looking to God for guidance and dependence. But whether or not you believe in the concept of sin, it is those examples of injustice and inequity, those examples of personal moral failures that I believe all of us have experienced, at least any of us who are in isolation with just ourselves or with others. In recent days and weeks, we've understood even better how vulnerable and needy we are, how much we have the capacity to love and to be loved, but also how fallen and broken we are. And again, that's true for us as individuals, and that's true collectively. So I want to read one more time this passage from Philippians and then ask the question, what gets in the way? What impedes living out of love? What ruins the ideal? Why don't we live this way? And then next week, I'm going to talk more about the hopeful side of this and about what it would mean to participate in love and healing and be motivated by that love. So one more time, Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Looking not just at this passage, but at the Bible as a whole, and again, thinking through just experience in the world, why don't we live this way? Why don't we live in such a way that we esteem others before ourselves, where we lay down our lives, where we act sacrificially, where we're motivated by love? We, I think, can agree that that would be wonderful if there was a social social contract to work that way, that would be delightful. But we don't. Why not? And sure, I could give you the answer, the kind of Sunday school answer of sin. We turn in on ourselves and away from God and away from other people, and we get stuck there. But what does that actually look like? What does it manifest itself as? And why do we live that way? I think the first reason we live that way is because we're distracted. And we're distracted by both our very busy lives and by entertainment. We have enough wealth in this country that we are not in need, or at least we're not aware of our neediness as often as we might be if wealth were not as prevalent. And we have all of these devices and shows and opportunities to distract ourselves from our deeper needs, our needs and longing for connection, our needs and longing for love, for meaning, for purpose, for forgiveness. We're able to distract ourselves and busy ourselves and entertain ourselves away from that. Although I believe that's different right now. In a time of social isolation and in a time of real pandemic concern, it's harder to distract ourselves with busyness and entertainment. And on the one hand, that can just lead to more coping strategies, healthy or not. But it also can lead us to actually dig deeper. That's what this podcast, I've talked about that in other weeks, to actually dig deeper and to say, what would it mean to put my roots into the soil of God's love and to live out of that place? So the first thing that impedes us from living out of love is distraction. The second thing is fear. And we've had a lot of fear right now. Honestly, we've had a lot of fear in our culture, a lot of it unwarranted, for a very long time. It's been called the age of anxiety. Anxiety medications are on the rise. Anxiety diagnoses for both young kids, teenagers, and adults have also been rising. Those are like technical disorders. But just the experience of stress or worry or fear or anxiety has been heightened in our culture in recent years, and that's absent the coronavirus. So we now have a pandemic, a literal pandemic, that is sweeping around the globe. And I've been listening to a podcast, which I recommend, called For the Life of the World, with a theologian named Miroslav Volf. And Miroslav Volf says, you know what? Fear is also behaving like a pandemic right now. It's infectious and it spreads, and we do not have immunity. We have not developed immunity against fear because we haven't faced it like this before. And I know for me, just as the weeks progress, started off going to the grocery store and people were kind of joking when we would give each other elbow taps, this being like maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, like, oh, I know I'm not supposed to shake your hand, but I'll tap your elbow. And then, okay, I've watched the video of the doctor telling me that I should behave as though all of my food has glitter on it and I need to disinfect it. And so, okay, I'm going to be wearing gloves. And other people are wearing gloves, and I'm judging the people who aren't wearing the gloves. And I'm feeling worried for the people behind the checkout register who aren't wearing the gloves. And then the masks come in, right? And so we cover our faces and our noses. And I think these are good practices to protect ourselves and to protect other people. But what I've noticed is how now in the grocery store, it's just increasingly somber. There's an increasing sense of fear. I have one friend who said, for 24 hours after I come back from being at the store, I just wonder, is there anyone who I could have hurt by my presence? Fear easily takes over and infects us. And one of the things that Miroslav Volf is talking about is how to have the right kind of fear and how to develop a trust in God that can help us overcome fear. So again, I recommend that podcast if you want to hear more on that topic. But fear can impede living out of love because, again, we turn in on ourselves. We isolate ourselves and we don't connect to other people. And then finally, injustice. Social divisions impede us from living lives of love because we're literally cut off from other people. We are cut off from people who are in different demographic categories than we are. And that inhibits us from having relationships of love and systems of love that overcome that injustice. As many of you know, I wrote a book called White Picket Fences, Turning Towards Love in a World Divided by Privilege, that came out in the fall of 2018, so a year and a half ago. And in that book, I write about my own experience as a person of what I would call privilege, where wealth and whiteness and education and a number of other factors contributed to allowing me to have access to opportunities that were not available to other people. And I want to talk a little bit about privilege for a minute here, because I do think that understanding these social divisions means understanding a little bit about privilege, about what it is not, and how it harms everyone. So I want to define what privilege is, what it is not, and how it harms everyone so that we can talk a little bit about how injustice impedes us from living in this life of love. So what privilege is? If I were in front of you with a whiteboard, I would be drawing a Venn diagram right now. So you can imagine a Venn diagram, and you can imagine some overlapping demographic measures. So again, race and ethnicity would be one circle on the diagram. Gender, the educational status of your parents, whether or not your parents are married. all sorts of social factors would go into that Venn diagram. And each of those social factors would be something that's unearned. So something that you didn't do anything to deserve or not deserve. You just were born into it. So again, for me, I was born into wealth. I was born into having married parents who were both college educated. I was born into whiteness. I was born into a Christian household. All of those different demographic factors actually gave me unearned social advantages. And what happens because we're humans, when there are certain groups of people who have unearned social advantages, is those unearned social advantages often lead to unjust social divisions. And they're usually not the decisions of one individual. No one is generally running out the door saying, I'm so excited to create some unjust systems that will advantage me and not other people today. But over time, what unearned social advantages do is they lead to unjust and sometimes simply out of ignorance, unjust social divisions. And unearned social advantages, when you look at them across a whole society and across a whole system, tend to lead to unjust social divisions. So when I'm talking about privilege, that's what I'm talking about. Those unearned social advantages and the injustice that they lead to and the social divisions that they lead to. But I'm not talking about, so here's what privilege is not. Privilege is not an accusation of moral or a moral judgment. Privilege is not an accusation or a moral judgment. It's not saying you are wrong simply by being who you are. What it is saying is, hey, take a look at who you are and the ways in which who you are was given to you, whether by God or by society, was given to you, and how other people were not given the same things. And then ask the question, what are you going to do about it? Another thing privilege is not, it's not saying you didn't work hard. I'm someone who has a lot of privilege, a lot of unearned social advantages, and I've worked really hard a lot of my life. In fact, in America, being privileged tends to go hand in hand with working really hard. So saying that someone has a life of privilege is not to say they have a life with no hard work. And it's also not to say that their life is an easy one. Plenty of people with privilege have had hard things happen, endure hard things day in and day out, whether that's the suffering of family members or the suffering of abuse or addiction. There's plenty of anxiety and harm, self-harm, and harm to other people that happens in privileged communities. We are all needy and broken and vulnerable people, and privilege does not mitigate that. So what privilege is? An unearned social advantage that leads to unjust social divisions. What it is not a moral judgment. It is not an accusation that you don't work hard, and it is not an accusation that you've had an easy life. But it is a form of separation. And that does become all the more evident in a time of widespread suffering like we have now, where we can see that the most vulnerable people are the most at risk. Those who are vulnerable physically, those who are vulnerable economically, those who are vulnerable socially, racially, ethnically, are at greater risk of harm in this time. At the same time, the reason privilege harms all of us, and not just those who are cut off from access to the advantages that people who would be considered privileged have, is that it cuts us off from one another. I miss out, and I've learned this most of all through our daughter Penny, who has Down syndrome. So Penny's someone who both falls inside and outside the walls of privilege. And for me, having Penny in my life has been this introduction to what it means to move outside the walls of privilege and to recognize the beauty, the grace, the joy, the challenges that exist there. I've written about this and I've spoken about this in many other contexts, and I'm not going to go into all of those details now. You can read White Picket Fences if you want to learn more. But what I learned is that being someone who's lived a life of privilege is not just cutting others off from the advantages that I have. It's also cutting me off from the richness of a life with a different set of values, with a need to ask some of those deeper questions of meaning and purpose. It's cut me off from mutual dependence and relationship with other people and with a wider array and diversity of people than I knew within my own privileged existence. And it's in acknowledging the harmfulness both within privilege and outside of it that has allowed me to begin to ask, how can we move towards healing? And how can we do that together? I believe that we've got a moment of opportunity here in our nation to identify and acknowledge harm that has been done through injustice in separating people from one another. That's happened again on individual levels, but it's also happened collectively through social divisions, through demographic advantages that are given to some people and not to others. When you identify and acknowledge harm, the point is not to expose the harm and just point fingers at it. I think about myself going into a doctor's visit or checkup. And what I do when I go to a new doctor is I tell them my health history. I'm 43 years old, but one of the things that I have recently been telling various doctors is that both my mother and my grandmother had colon cancer when they were about 55. As a result of telling my doctors about the colon cancer that I had nothing to do with, this is my mother and my grandmother, I tell them about that. And you know what they tell me? They tell me that I am a lucky recipient of an early colonoscopy, which obviously is unpleasant. And who wants a colonoscopy? But I tell them that because I know that identifying this potential harm, to say, look, I see the harm that's out there and I'm identifying it and I'm acknowledging it, can actually allow us to take preventative measures to keep me safe. And the same is true if we acknowledge and identify the harm within our society, the harm that we participate in, sometimes unwittingly, just by being born. And sometimes it's harm that we perpetrate because we do things out of ignorance or out of selfishness. But either way, the harm is out there. And if we can acknowledge that and identify it, then we can begin to participate in healing. And that's the invitation to us and for us. So going back to Philippians for a moment, what Paul is talking about here is a new way of living, a new social contract in which we so understand the inestimable value that God places upon us. We so understand how beloved we are, and we are so rooted and established in that love that we are able to actually consider others better than ourselves. Imagine, you know that you are of inestimable worth, and you look around and you see all these other people who are also of inestimable worth. How do you behave now? So it's out of that place of love that we begin to learn how to love one another, how to lay down our lives, not out of some sort of self-flagellation, but out of honoring who we are, who our fellow human beings are, and who God is, and what God has done for us. There's a vision here that Paul gives us of what it looks like to be motivated by love. And that's where I want to live. I go back to William at the dinner table in awe of the thought of living like Jesus and knowing that it seemed really impossible. I want to be someone who is motivated by love, not just in passing water at the dinner table, but in how I give money away, in how I participate in society, in how I vote, in how I care for other people on both an individual level and in what I'm engaged in on a collective level. When I look at this past month of the coronavirus and I see, again, the human glory and the human shame, the selfishness and the self-sacrifice, I want to participate in love. And I believe that Paul's words to the Philippians have a lot to offer to us in understanding the way of love. So this week we had a chance to ask the question, what impedes us from living this ideal life? And we looked at distraction and fear and injustice. There's much more to say on all of those topics, but all of them impede us from living lives of love. Next week, we're going to look at what allows us to live lives of love in this time of social distancing, this time of the coronavirus. What allows us to live lives of love, and what motivates us to live lives of love. I hope you'll be back. I hope you'll share this with friends, and I hope we can continue to encourage each other to live lives with mutual self-sacrifice, mutual esteem, and mutual joy. I just want to end with the reminder that love is stronger than fear. May we all understand more and more deeply the truth of that statement and the power of the love that fuels the universe and allows us to live in freedom without fear, filled with the deep, deep love of God. Thanks again for tuning in to the Love is Stronger Than Fear podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can find more resources at my website, amyjuliabecker.com. And if you found today's episode helpful, please share it with friends and take a minute to rate and review it wherever you find your podcasts. See you next week.